Hello, my name is Ariel Rose Fishkin, and I want to talk to you today about developing a dynamic voice. A dynamic voice. What is a dynamic voice? What is that? Well, basically, a dynamic voice is a voice that is the opposite of a monotone voice, basically. It's a voice that varies in pitch. It's a voice that effectively uses intonations. It's a voice that doesn't put you to sleep when you listen to it. You're probably asking yourself, what makes you such an expert on developing a dynamic voice? I'm not an expert, but I did read about it in a book. And now I want to share with you some of the tips I learned so that you don't have to read the book. That book was called It's the Way You Say It, Becoming Articulate, Well-Spoken, and Clear by Carol A. Fleming. Carol Fleming, PhD. I do want to say at the outset of this that I do not really believe in or condone the act of policing other people's voices. There are certain situations or jobs where speaking to others may be a big part of what you do. In that case, your primary tool may in fact be your voice, and it might make sense for you to want to use that tool as effectively as possible. The most obvious example of this would be public speaking. If you're going to be doing a lot of public speaking in your life, it's relatively important to have a dynamic voice so that people want to listen to you. And having an interesting voice, having a dynamic voice, having a voice that does capture people's interest, a lot of the time just means having a voice with variety in it. Certain scientific studies have played individuals a set of overlapping voices. Researchers asked the listeners to pick out one of the voices of the many that were overlapping, and the majority of the time the listeners picked out the voice that had the most vocal variety. Basically what this means is that if you want your voice to stand out among others, and or you want to keep people interested when you're talking for a long period of time, developing a dynamic voice may be something that will be useful for you to do. A dynamic voice is generally very expressive, and for some individuals, the roadblock to developing a dynamic voice may lie in a general discomfort with being expressive or vulnerable in the first place. If you think this may be you, there are a couple general activities that you can try that promote being expressive in general. Dramatic enterprises would be one of these activities. To be or not to be. This can include serious acting, just acting for fun in your own home, doing some improvisational theater. Another such activity is dancing. While dancing doesn't typically involve your voice, it is very physical and could get you comfortable with being expressive. Practicing singing is another way to practice being dynamic and expressive in your vocal expression. Aside from engaging in activities that can promote expression in general, there are some speaking-specific exercises you can do to try and develop a dynamic voice. If you do feel that your voice is relatively monotone, one sort of interesting activity would be to find the voice of someone that you find dynamic and interesting to listen to, and actually kind of just imitate them. Another aspect of a dynamic voice is that it also tends to be resonant. Now when it comes to resonant voices, those are voices that are usually coming from the chest, as opposed to less resonant voices, which are generally coming from the head. Head voices tend to sound more nasally. Resonant voices are those ones that you can hear from the next room over because it's vibrating the walls. Those voices also tend to be deep, but having a resonant voice doesn't necessarily mean that your voice has to be deep. So for an example right now, I'm gonna change my voice between resonant and more heady. This is my head voice. It's coming from my head. It's really coming like from my mouth. It's not really originating in my chest area, but if I move it down here, there's more breath behind it. It's coming into my chest, coming out of my chest. I can project more. If you want to practice this, what I would suggest doing is taking a deep breath before speaking. And then when you speak, imagine that the air is coming from your chest area, that the power behind your voice is coming from your chest area. If you've ever had singing lessons, this will probably sound pretty familiar because it's general advice in singing. But it's also really helpful for speaking if you are trying to develop a voice that's more dynamic and more resonant. Something that Dr. Carroll doesn't really discuss in this chapter is the fact that a lot of people who don't have monotone voices, normally speaking, end up sounding kind of monotone when they go up and are doing public speaking. I think that most of the time this is less a flaw in the person's voice as it is originating from the fact that they're reading off of a script. If you're in a situation where you don't really mind your voice in everyday life, but you've heard yourself recorded during speeches and you think you just sound boring or stark or kind of dry, my main suggestion would be to really get to know the material before you go up and present it. Trying to sound natural when you're reading directly off a paper is really challenging. And then if you had the added pressure of speaking in front of a group of people, then it's going to be really difficult for you to read and just sound like you're naturally speaking. So that's it for me. I hope that this will help you in some way develop a dynamic voice, and a shout out to Dr. Carroll for providing these helpful tips for us.